The air was thick with ash, the scent of charred metal and scorched earth invading Elias Varen's nostrils like a cruel reminder of what was lost. He stood atop the shattered remains of a once glorious skyscraper, its glass facade now jagged and blackened. The sky above was a haunting gray, fractured by the ominous glow of alien dreadnoughts retreating into the stratosphere. They didn't linger to survey their destruction. They didn't need to. Earth was broken, a smoldering graveyard of forgotten promises. Elias clenched his fists, feeling the grit of soil and soot between his fingers. The weight of loss pressed on his chest, a cold, suffocating thing that robbed him of breath. Around him the city sprawled in ruin. Cars lay overturned on melted asphalt, their windows shattered and frames twisted. Buildings were hollowed-out skeletons, their once proud spires reduced to rubble. In the distance, a faint wail echoed like the ghost of humanity itself mourning its demise. He exhaled shakily, his breath misting in the cool, contaminated air. The transmitter in his hand hummed faintly, its interface cracked but functional. This was the last piece of technology he had salvaged before the alien bombardment began. "Elias!" a voice called from below, sharp and urgent. He turned to see Dr. Alira Thine, her silhouette framed by the jagged ruins of a collapsed bridge. She was bloodied, her once pristine lab coat now tattered, but her eyes burned with determination. "We have to move. Their scouts could still be sweeping for survivors." Elias ignored her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The alien fleet was a dark smear retreating into the clouds, their work done. "Not yet," he said, his voice low, a growl that startled even him. He pressed a button on the transmitter, the small screen flickering to life. "What are you doing?" Alira climbed the rubble to stand beside him, her brow furrowed. "Making a promise," Elias replied, his thumb hovering over the device. His face was a mask of grim resolve, his jaw tight, eyes glinting like shards of broken glass. "If they think this is over, they're wrong." The transmitter crackled as he began to speak, his words deliberate, heavy with the weight of humanity's fury. "This is Elias Varen. To the galaxy that watches us burn, to the Zalin Empire, you think you've won. You think Earth is gone, and with it humanity's fire, but you're wrong. We are more than this soil, more than the ruins you've left behind. We're an idea, a promise, and ideas can't be destroyed." Alira's breath caught. For a moment, even the desolation around them seemed to hold its breath. "We'll be back," Elias said, each syllable a bullet, each word a vow etched in iron. The transmitter pulsed as the message was broadcast, cutting through the void of space like a blade. He knew it wouldn't reach Earth's oppressors immediately, but it didn't matter. This wasn't just for the Zalrin, it was for the survivors, for the scattered remnants of humanity who needed to remember what they were fighting for. Behind him, Alira placed a hand on his shoulder. "You think that'll scare them?" "No," Elias admitted, his voice softening, though the fire in his eyes remained. "But it'll remind them to look over their shoulder. It'll remind them that we're still here." A distant rumble broke the fragile moment, the sound of collapsing concrete as another skyscraper gave way. Elias turned, scanning the horizon. "We need to get underground, now." They descended the rubble, their movements quick but deliberate. The ground beneath their boots crunched, the sharp sound mingling with the distant crackle of fires still burning. The air tasted acrid, each breath a reminder of the toxic fallout. As they moved, Elias's mind raced. Memories clawed at him, his mother's laughter, his father's steady voice, the warmth of their family home. All gone now, reduced to shadows and echoes. He shoved the memories aside, burying them beneath a growing resolve. "Where's Voss?" Elias asked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Waiting at the rendezvous point," Alira said. "But if we don't hurry—" Her words were cut off by a piercing screech, the unmistakable sound of an alien drone overhead. Both of them froze, their eyes darting skyward. The drone was sleek and black, its surface glinting like obsidian as it hovered, its sensors scanning the wreckage. Elias's pulse quickened. If they were spotted, the Zalrin would send reinforcements to finish the job. "Down!" he hissed, pulling Alira into the shadow of a crumbled wall. The drone hovered closer, its hum a low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. Elias could feel the heat of its thrusters, could smell the faint, acrid scent of alien fuel. Alira's breath was shallow beside him, her hands trembling as she clutched a small satchel of salvaged equipment. Elias's mind raced. If the drone scanned too closely, it would detect their heat signatures. They needed a distraction. Elias scanned the rubble and spotted a piece of reflective metal half buried nearby. Slowly, he reached for it, every movement calculated, deliberate. He caught Alira's eye and mouthed, "Trust me." With a sudden flick, he hurled the metal shard toward a distant pile of debris. The shard caught the faint light of the fires, reflecting it in a dazzling arc. The drone's sensors beeped, and it shifted toward the noise, its hum rising in pitch. "Go," Elias whispered. They darted from their hiding place, moving silently through the shadows. The tension was suffocating, each step a gamble. Finally, they reached a collapsed subway tunnel, its jagged opening like the mouth of a beast. Inside, the air was damp and cold, the darkness pressing in around them. The faint glow of bioluminescent markers, placed by Voss, guided their way deeper. The sound of water dripping echoed in the silence, mingling with their labored breathing. As they rounded a corner, a figure emerged from the shadows. Kellen Voss, tall and imposing, his features sharp and alien, but his expression unmistakably human in its concern. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Had to send a message," Elias replied, his tone flat. Voss raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to Alira. "He finally snapped?" Alira shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite the tension. "Not yet. But he's getting close." Voss chuckled, the sound unexpectedly warm. "Good. Snap harder. We'll need it." Elias ignored the banter, his focus already on the next step. "How are we on supplies?" "Barely enough," Voss admitted. "But we've got what we need to move. The rest, we'll figure out." Elias nodded, his mind already spinning with possibilities. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a seed, buried in the ashes, waiting to grow. As they settled in, Elias allowed himself one last glance toward the surface, toward the ruins of the world he had known. "We'll be back," he murmured, the words a prayer, a promise, and a curse. Elias Varen leaned against the cold, damp wall of the subway tunnel, the rough texture scraping against his shoulder. The dim glow of bioluminescent markers lit the space with a ghostly blue hue, casting shadows that seemed to breathe with each flicker of light. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of rust and the faint stench of stagnant water. Every sound felt amplified in the oppressive silence, the soft drip of condensation from overhead pipes, the scuff of boots against the cracked tiles, the muffled hum of machinery in the depths. "We can't stay here much longer," Voss said, his deep voice cutting through the stillness. He was crouched near a makeshift console, the screen illuminating the sharp contours of his alien features. His hands moved with precision, adjusting wires and tapping commands with an almost mechanical efficiency. "The Zalin will send more scouts. They'll sweep this sector clean." Elias didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the small transmitter he had used to broadcast his message, now silent and dark. The words still echoed in his mind. "We'll be back." It was a promise he intended to keep, but promises alone wouldn't rebuild humanity. They needed strategy, allies, and most of all, time. Alira broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. "We've salvaged enough for now. The generator is stable and the lab equipment is functional. If we push deeper into the tunnels, we can fortify a new base. It won't be perfect, but it's better than staying here." Elias nodded, the tension in his jaw relaxing slightly. "We move at first light, or what's left of it. The drones won't risk losing visibility in the lower atmosphere." Voss let out a low grunt of approval. "Good. I'm not exactly keen on being vaporized because someone couldn't keep quiet." Alira shot him a glare, but her lips twitched into a faint smile. "Don't worry, Voss. I'll make sure your heroic sacrifice is written into history." "Funny. Voss replied, his mouth curling into a smirk. "Let's just focus on not dying." Elias pushed off the wall, his boots echoing faintly as he paced. His thoughts churned like storm clouds, heavy with doubt and determination. The small coalition they had managed to form so far was barely more than a skeleton crew. Scattered survivors from devastated colonies, a handful of engineers, and a few fighters hardened by desperation. They had no fleet, no resources, and no guarantees. But they had him, and Elias had a plan. "Let's start inventory," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Alira, prioritize the power cells and medical supplies. Voss, I need an update on the communications array. If we can get a signal out to the Proxima colony, they might still have—" The sudden crash of metal echoed through the tunnel, freezing them all in place. Elias's hand instinctively went to the pistol at his side, the cold weight of it a meager comfort. He exchanged a glance with Voss, who had already drawn his blade, a serrated alien weapon that glinted wickedly in the faint light. "Stay here," Elias whispered to Alira, his tone leaving no room for argument. Moving silently, Elias and Voss advanced toward the source of the noise. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the shadows growing deeper, thicker, like a living thing waiting to swallow them whole. The faint scent of burnt ozone pricked at Elias's nose, a telltale sign of Zalin technology. As they rounded a bend, Elias's pulse quickened. A faint flickering light danced on the walls ahead, accompanied by a low mechanical hum. They pressed against the wall, peering cautiously around the corner. A drone lay in the middle of the tunnel, its sleek black frame partially dismantled. Sparks arced from its exposed circuits, the acrid smell of fried components filling the air. Standing over it was a figure cloaked in shadow, their features obscured but their movements deliberate. They were dismantling the drone with precision, pulling components from its chassis and slipping them into a satchel. "Identify yourself," Elias called, his voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. The figure froze, then slowly raised their hands. "Easy," they said, their tone calm and measured. As they stepped into the light, their face became visible. A young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with sharp, angular features and piercing green eyes. His dark hair was matted with sweat and grime, and his clothes were a patchwork of scavenged materials. "I'm not with them," the man said, nodding toward the drone. "Name's Arlen, and unless you're planning to shoot, I'd rather keep this civil." Elias lowered his weapon slightly but didn't relax. "What are you doing here?" "Same as you, I'd guess," Arlen replied, gesturing to the dismantled drone. "Trying to survive. This beauty here? It's loaded with enough parts to power a small settlement. Figured I'd help myself before they come back looking for it." Voss narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening on his blade. "And how do we know you're not bait?" Arlen let out a dry laugh. "If I were bait, you'd already be dead. Look, I don't want trouble, but I do want to live. And judging by the looks of you lot, I'd say you're planning something bigger than just survival." Elias studied him for a moment, his mind calculating the risks. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, but resources, and people, were in short supply. "Fine," Elias said finally. "But you follow our rules. One mistake, and you're out." Arlen smirked, his green eyes glinting with a mix of relief and mischief. "Fair enough. So, what's the plan, boss?" They returned to the base with Arlen in tow, the tension easing slightly as the group settled back into the rhythm of their work. Alira eyed the newcomer warily but said nothing, focusing instead on organizing the supplies. Voss kept his distance, his gaze sharp and untrusting. As the hours passed, Elias gathered the group around a rough map of the subway network. The map was faded and torn, but it was their lifeline, a guide to the forgotten depths where they could hide and rebuild. "We move here," Elias said, pointing to a junction deep within the tunnels. "It's farther from the surface, harder to detect. We'll set up a new base and start laying the groundwork for the next phase." "And what's the next phase?" Arlen asked, leaning casually against the wall. Elias met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "We rebuild, quietly, patiently. When the time comes, the galaxy won't see us coming." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The group exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. They were few, battered and broken, but they were alive. And as long as they lived, so did the hope of humanity's return. As the group dispersed to prepare for the move, Elias lingered by the console, staring at the silent transmitter. He could still hear the echoes of his promise, whispered in the recesses of his mind. "We'll be back." But as the darkness of the tunnel closed in around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The air in the new base was colder, damp with the scent of moss and mineral-laced water. Every breath carried a chill that coiled in Elias Varen's lungs like a silent warning. The faint hum of generators echoed through the cavernous space, their makeshift operations alive with an urgent energy. Drones hovered in the shadows, their movements almost predatory as they scanned for any signs of a threat. The base wasn't perfect, but it was secure, hidden beneath layers of rock and silence. Elias paced along the main walkway, his boots scuffing against the uneven ground. His eyes flicked to the activity around him. Engineers welding salvaged metal into crude armor, technicians carefully assembling weapons from mismatched parts, and scouts hunched over consoles, monitoring encrypted transmissions. It was progress, but it wasn't enough. The galaxy was vast, and the Zalin Empire was a behemoth, a predator whose hunger for domination had consumed entire systems. Elias knew their time was running out. "Elias!" Alira called from across the room. She stood near the central console, her face illuminated by its pale blue glow. Her sharp eyes tracked the data scrolling across the screen. "We have a problem." Elias crossed the room, his heartbeat quickening. "What kind of problem?" "Intercepted chatter from one of the Zalin patrols," Alira said, her voice low. "They're escalating their scans in this sector. It's only a matter of time before they realize we've moved." The words struck Elias like a hammer, but he didn't flinch. "How much time?" "Days, maybe less," Alira replied. Her fingers danced over the console, bringing up a map of their surrounding region. Red markers pulsed ominously, each one representing a potential threat. Elias stared at the screen, his mind racing. They had anticipated this, but not so soon. The coalition wasn't ready for open confrontation. Not yet. He clenched his jaw, pushing down the frustration that threatened to rise. "We need to divert them," he said finally. "A misdirection, something to keep them occupied." Voss appeared beside them, his hulking form a solid presence in the tense atmosphere. "That's risky," he said, his deep voice carrying a hint of skepticism. "If they catch wind of us, they'll bring the full force of their fleet. We're not equipped to handle that." "Not yet," Elias said, his tone sharp. "But we don't need to fight them head-on. We just need to make them look somewhere else." Voss's gaze hardened, but he gave a curt nod. "What's the play?" Elias turned to Alira. "How soon can we rig a decoy? Something loud enough to get their attention, but far enough to keep them off our trail." Alira hesitated, her brows furrowing in thought. "We'd need to use one of the drones. Maybe set up a false energy signature in a nearby system. It won't hold them for long, but it could buy us a few days." "Make it happen," Elias said. "Voss, I want a team ready to deploy within the hour." As the two moved to carry out his orders, Elias lingered by the console, his eyes tracing the red markers on the map. Each one felt like a noose tightening around their fragile existence. They were running out of shadows to hide in. A voice broke his thoughts, smooth and laced with a quiet curiosity. "You're playing a dangerous game, Varen." Elias turned to see Arlen leaning casually against a stack of supply crates. The young scavenger had proven resourceful since joining them, but his irreverence grated on Elias's nerves. "It's the only game we've got," Elias replied. Arlen tilted his head, his green eyes gleaming with something between amusement and intrigue. "And what happens when the Zalrin stop chasing shadows? When they come knocking at your door?" Elias met his gaze, his expression unyielding. "Then we'll show them what happens when you corner humanity." Arlen's smirk widened, but he said nothing more, slipping back into the shadows like a wraith. Elias watched him go, unease prickling at the edges of his thoughts. Trust was a scarce commodity, and Arlen kept his cards too close to his chest. Hours later, the decoy operation was underway. A team of scouts, led by Voss, had deployed a modified drone to a desolate system on the edge of Zalin-controlled space. The false energy signature it emitted would mimic a small fleet, drawing the Zalrin's attention like moths to a flame. It was a gamble, but one Elias was willing to take. In the meantime, the base buzzed with activity. Alira oversaw the calibration of new weapon systems, her sharp commands cutting through the noise. Engineers worked tirelessly, their faces smudged with oil and sweat. Every bolt tightened, every circuit soldered, was a step closer to survival. Elias moved among them, offering quiet words of encouragement where he could. These people were more than survivors. They were the foundation of humanity's resurgence. Each one carried the weight of their shared loss, but also the spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the base grew palpable. The decoy had been deployed, but there was no way to know if it would succeed. Scouts monitored the Zalrin communications channels, their faces tight with concentration. Then the signal came. "Zalrin patrols are moving," one of the scouts reported, his voice taut with urgency. "They've picked up the decoy and are diverting forces to investigate." A collective exhale rippled through the room, a brief moment of relief. But Elias didn't allow himself to relax. This was only the beginning. "Good," he said, "but stay alert. If they realize it's a decoy, they'll double back." As the night wore on, the base settled into a tense quiet. Elias found himself alone in the command chamber, staring at the flickering map on the console. The red markers had shifted, but they still loomed like specters, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. The door hissed open, and Alira stepped inside. She hesitated before speaking, her voice soft. "You should get some rest." Elias didn't look at her. "There's no time." "You say that every night," Alira said, her tone tinged with both frustration and concern. "But even you can't carry this alone." Elias finally turned to face her, the weight of his responsibilities etched into every line of his face. "I don't have a choice. If I stop, even for a moment, this all falls apart." Alira stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You're wrong. You're not alone in this, Elias. None of us are. But if you burn yourself out before the real fight even begins, what good will you be to anyone?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. For a moment Elias said nothing, his mind warring with itself. Then he gave a small nod, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to stop." Alira's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to stop, just let us help. You've carried us this far. Let us carry you for a while." Elias met her gaze, the unspoken bond between them stronger than any words could convey. He nodded again, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. For the first time in weeks he allowed himself to hope, not just for survival, but for something more. As Alira left the chamber, Elias turned back to the console, his resolve hardening once more. The shadows of war were closing in, but humanity had not yet played its final hand, and when they did, the galaxy would never forget. Elias Varen sat at the edge of the command platform, his eyes fixed on the holographic map hovering above the console. The blue glow bathed his face, reflecting the faint twitch of his lips as his mind churned through a storm of calculations. The decoy had worked. The Zalrin Empire had taken the bait. But distractions could only last so long. Sooner or later the Empire's gaze would return, and this time they would come with more than scouts. "Zoom in on Sector 7, Elias ordered. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of command. Alira manipulated the console, her fingers gliding over the controls like a pianist commanding a symphony. The hologram shifted, focusing on a star system nestled at the fringes of Zalrin-controlled space. The system was unremarkable to most, a dead zone of abandoned colonies and asteroid fields. But to Elias, it was the perfect staging ground. "We need to turn this sector into a choke point," he said, gesturing to the asteroid clusters marked in red. "The Zalrin will come through here when they double back. They'll expect an open corridor. Instead, we give them a minefield." Minefield? Arlen asked, leaning against a support beam with his usual casual arrogance. That's ambitious for a group that can barely keep the lights on. Ambitious, Elias repeated, fixing him with a sharp glare, is the only reason we're still alive. Elias is right, Alira said, her tone brisk. We can retrofit the drones with explosive charges. Position them within the asteroid field. When the Zalin ships move through, they'll trigger the charges. And if they don't? Voss asked, his arms crossed over his broad chest. His skepticism was palpable. They will, Elias said with quiet certainty. The Zalin rely on speed and precision. They won't waste time charting an alternate course unless they sense a trap. The room fell silent, the weight of the plan settling over the group like a heavy cloak. The strategy was risky, but it was also their best chance to buy more time. More than that, it was a statement. Humanity wasn't just hiding anymore, they were fighting back. Alira, Elias continued, I need you to oversee the retrofits. Prioritize the drones with long-range sensors. Voss, gather your team. You'll escort the deployment crews to the asteroid field and ensure the charges are placed correctly. Voss gave a curt nod. And if we run into resistance? You won't engage, Elias said firmly. Your mission is to deploy the mines and get out. We can't afford to lose anyone. Understood, Voss said, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. Elias turned to Arlen, who was watching the proceedings with a detached expression. You're coming with me. Arlen raised an eyebrow. Am I? And where exactly are we going? To the communications relay, Elias replied. If this plan works, the Zalin will send reinforcements. We need to intercept their signals and feed them false intel. Lead them into another dead zone. Arlen smirked, his green eyes glinting with mischief. Finally, a job that suits my talents. You'll be under my command, Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Stick to the plan, or you'll answer to me. Noted, Arlen said, though his grin didn't falter. As the team dispersed to carry out their assignments, the base buzzed with activity. The air was thick with the acrid scent of welding torches and the faint hum of drone engines. Every corner of the space echoed with the clang of metal and the murmur of hurried conversations. Elias moved among the crew, his presence a steady anchor amid the chaos. He offered a nod here, a word of encouragement there, but his mind never stopped racing. Later, as the deployment teams prepared to leave, Elias stood by the airlock, watching Voss and his crew load the drones onto the transport ship. The cold, metallic scent of the bay mingled with the faint whir of machinery, creating a symphony of tension and purpose. You think this will work? Voss asked, his voice low. Elias didn't hesitate. It has to. Voss studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. See you on the other side. Elias clasped his forearm, a rare gesture of camaraderie. Good luck. As the transport ship lifted off, its engines roaring to life, Elias felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He watched the ship disappear into the black void, a silent prayer on his lips. They were more than soldiers or survivors. They were humanity's last hope. The journey to the communications relay was uneventful, the small craft cutting silently through the darkness of space. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Elias sat in the cockpit, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of stars. Beside him, Arlen hummed softly, his hands idly tapping against the console. You're awfully quiet, Arlen said, breaking the silence. Elias didn't look at him. Focus on the mission, Arlen chuckled. You know, for someone leading the charge against an empire, you could use a sense of humor. Elias turned to him, his expression hard. Humor won't bring Earth back. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Arlen's smirk faltered, and he turned his attention back to the console. When they reached the relay, Elias felt a chill crawl down his spine. The station was a relic from before the fall of Earth, its battered frame orbiting a dead planet. The airlock hissed open, revealing a dimly lit corridor lined with flickering lights. The scent of stale air and oil filled their nostrils as they stepped inside. This place gives me the creeps, Arlen muttered, his voice echoing in the silence. "Good," Elias said. "It means no one else will come here." They moved quickly, navigating the labyrinth of narrow passageways to reach the control room. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor creaked beneath their boots. The relay's main console was intact, though its surface was coated in a fine layer of dust. Elias set to work immediately, his fingers flying over the controls. The console hummed to life, its screen glowing with a pale blue light. Data began to stream in, lines of alien script interspersed with human encryption codes. "Can you read that?" Arlen asked, leaning over his shoulder. "Enough," Elias replied, his focus unbroken. The intercepted signals were chaotic, a cacophony of orders and counter-orders as the Zalin forces scrambled to respond to the decoy. Elias scanned the transmissions, searching for a pattern, a weakness he could exploit. "There," he said, pointing to a cluster of data. "They're mobilizing reinforcements from the Triarch system. If we reroute their fleet to Sector 11, they'll run straight into a black hole," Arlen finished, a grin spreading across his face. "Not bad, Varen." Elias ignored the comment, his focus razor-sharp as he began inputting the false coordinates. The console beeped in acknowledgement, the data stream shifting as the new orders were transmitted. As they finished, a faint rumble shook the station, followed by a low, ominous hum. Elias's heart sank. They found us. Arlen's grin vanished. "What do we do?" Elias turned to him, his expression grim. "We improvise." The low hum grew into a deep, resonant growl, vibrating through the relay station's walls. Elias Varen stood motionless for a moment, his mind calculating at the speed of light. The Zalrin had found them faster than expected. Their efficiency was both a threat and a confirmation of his strategy. They were scared. For the first time, the predators were hunting in haste. "Arlen!" Elias barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Seal the outer doors. Buy us some time." Arlen hesitated, his usual bravado stripped away by the gravity of the moment. "And then what? We just wait for them to breach?" "No," Elias said, his tone cold as iron. "We make them regret coming." The sharp scent of overheated circuitry filled the air as Elias keyed in override codes on the console, rerouting power to the station's ancient defense systems. Sparks danced like fireflies in the dimly lit room as dormant cannons rumbled to life, their targeting systems locking onto the incoming Zalrin ships. Outside, the station groaned as its automated turrets opened fire. Blue streaks of plasma cut through the void, catching the sleek Zalrin fighters mid-maneuver. Explosions flared like brief stars, painting the dark expanse with bursts of light. But for every ship destroyed, another took its place, their ominous forms closing in. "Those turrets won't hold them off for long," Arlen said, his voice tinged with desperation. "We need a way out." "There is no way out," Elias replied, his eyes never leaving the console. "Not for us." Arlen stared at him, stunned. "You're planning to go down with this place?" Elias turned to him, his expression unreadable. "If it means buying enough time for the others, then yes." Before Arlen could respond, the door to the control room slid open, revealing Alira Thine and Voss, both armed and ready. The scent of ozone and burnt metal clung to them, their faces hardened by battle. "We've got incoming," Voss said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "2 squads, fully armed. They'll be here in minutes." Elias nodded, his mind already racing. "Alira, set the station's core to overload. If we can't hold them, we take them with us." Alira hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "There's another way." Elias raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Alira stepped forward, her gaze fierce. "The Zalrin expect us to fight like prey, to defend until we're overwhelmed. But if we go on the offensive, disrupt their chain of command." "They'll hesitate," Voss finished, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "And hesitation kills." Elias considered her words, the room's silence broken only by the distant rumble of explosions. She was right. The Zalrin's strength lay in their precision, their ability to overwhelm through fear and calculated strikes. But fear was a weapon that could be turned. "Fine," Elias said, his voice firm. "We take the fight to them, but we do it on our terms." Alira immediately moved to the console, her fingers flying over the controls. The station's power core pulsed as it rerouted energy, transforming the aging relay into a beacon of raw, focused power. Outside, the turrets intensified their assault, forcing the Zalin ships to scatter. Elias turned to Voss and Arlen. "Gear up. We're boarding one of their cruisers." Arlen blinked. "You're serious?" "Deadly," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Their command structure relies on centralized communication. If we take out their flagship, the rest will fall into disarray." Voss grinned, the anticipation of battle lighting his eyes. Finally, something worth dying for. As the team suited up, the airlock hissed open, revealing the cold, endless void beyond. The sleek Zalin cruiser loomed ahead, its dark hull shimmering with deadly grace. Elias led the charge, his team propelled through space by their thruster packs. The silence of the vacuum pressed around them, broken only by the faint hum of their suits. They landed on the cruiser's hull with a soft clang, their magnetic boots anchoring them in place. Alira hacked into the ship's outer defenses, her tools a blur of motion. Within seconds, a hatch hissed open, revealing the dimly lit interior. The scent of sterilized air hit them as they entered, mingling with the faint hum of alien machinery. The corridors were cold and sterile, their walls lined with pulsating conduits that cast an eerie green light. Every step echoed ominously, a reminder that they were deep in enemy territory. "Keep moving," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "We need to reach the bridge before they realize we're here." They advanced quickly, their weapons ready. The first Zalin patrol rounded the corner too late to react, their sleek, insectoid forms crumpling under a precise volley of gunfire. The smell of scorched chitin filled the air as the team pressed on, leaving the bodies behind. When they reached the bridge, the door was sealed, its surface glowing with an energy shield. Alira set to work, her face tense with concentration. "Give me 30 seconds, she said. "We don't have 30 seconds, Voss muttered, his weapon trained on the corridor behind them. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, the telltale clatter of Zalin claws against metal. Elias stepped forward, planting a charge against the shielded door. "Step back," he said. The explosion rocked the ship, the shield shattering in a burst of light. The team stormed the bridge, their weapons cutting through the surprised crew. The Zalin commander, a towering figure with gleaming black carapace and piercing red eyes, turned to face them. "You dare board our ship?" the commander hissed, its voice dripping with disdain. Elias stepped forward, his weapon leveled. "We're not just boarding your ship, we're ending this." The commander lunged, its claws slashing through the air, but Elias sidestepped with practiced precision. He fired a single shot, the bullet piercing the commander's chest. The alien fell with a guttural cry, its body collapsing in a heap. Alira moved to the command console, her hands flying over the alien interface. "I'm uploading the virus now. Once it's in their systems, they won't be able to coordinate." "Hurry," Elias said, his eyes scanning the room. The Zalin forces were regrouping outside the bridge, their shadows flickering in the dim light. The console beeped, and Alira stepped back. "It's done." Elias activated his comm. "All teams, fall back. The Zalin fleet is crippled. Let's finish this." As they retreated to their ship, the cruiser's systems began to falter. Lights flickered, and the hum of its engines grew erratic. By the time they reached their base, the Zalin fleet was in disarray, their ships drifting aimlessly as the virus spread. Elias stood on the command platform, watching the chaos unfold on the holographic map. The Zalin, once invincible, were now vulnerable. It wasn't just a victory, it was a reckoning. As the team gathered around him, Elias spoke, his voice steady and resolute. "This isn't the end. It's the beginning. Humanity will rise from the ashes, stronger than ever. And when the galaxy remembers this day, they'll remember the words that started it all." He paused, his gaze sweeping over his team, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a promise. "We'll be back."